Okay, and welcome. So, we're going to be covering one shock in this particular lecture, and it's going to be the one shock that is really of primary interest. If you have questions about any of the other shocks, if you'd like to see any of the other shocks, you can always refer to the textbook. You can refer to the lecture that I put up online, the previous YouTube lecture, with the slideshow. And if you really have any questions about other shocks, if you're really truly interested, you can always ask me. We can talk about it. But when it comes to the content of this course, it just seems like there's really only one shock that is of any supreme interest to me, especially when it comes to talking about the last little subject of sorts in the new Keynesian model. So it's just this one shock that we're going to talk about. Now, if you remember from the real business cycle model, if there was a monetary policy shock, ultimately the LM curve would shift out, but prices would be perfectly flexible. Isis, don't claw that. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. No. Yeah, hang out there. That's a good spot to hang out. Hang out on the Christmas tree. My apologies. LM curve shifts out, but because prices are perfectly flexible with a vertical aggregate supply curve, the LM curve basically just shifts out and it shifts right back into where it started. The interest rate tries to drop, but it eventually snaps right back up, and all that really happens is the price level responds to a monetary policy shock, and no real variables respond. But that's when we have perfectly flexible prices. If we don't have perfectly flexible prices, meaning prices are sticky, they're slow to adjust, then we get slightly different results. So as we can see here, things have changed a little bit. And they've really only changed in this graph, because here we've got labor markets, labor supply, labor demand. Okay. It's not all that different from what we saw before. Actually, it's identical to what we saw before. Notation here is a little different, because in the new Keynesian model, there's no capital. There's no capital because the results would be unchanged if we put capital in there. So it's a simplifying assumption for the baseline new Keynesian model. So, okay, well this is the same. The stuff up here is the same, which really just means this. Well, we still have a vertical aggregate supply curve in the new Keynesian model, but it's the long run aggregate supply curve. We'll get to why it's long run in a bit. But we also have a short run aggregate supply curve, right? Because in the short run, prices are sticky. So if prices are to change a little in the short run, there will be short run responses to output, but in the long run, there won't be. Now, I had said that firms have rational expectations, right? There's rational expectations in the model. Therefore, they are setting their price level to the expected price level, call it E of P0, right? So the expectation of the price level is where this price level is currently sitting. So every period when firms get to change their prices, right? Some get to, not all get to. When they all get to change their prices, we end up at an expected price level. The intermediate price setting, the intermediate price adjustment phase, on the other hand, is not going to be an expected price level. But when short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand are equal, we have an expected price level. So if the short run aggregate supply is not at the same point as the long run aggregate supply where aggregate demand crosses, there's no expected price level. It's just an intermediate price level. So it'll just be like, say, P1 rather than E of P0, right? So with all that said, all that knocked out of the way, let's get into a monetary policy shock. Forgive the asthma. And also for those of you who have sent me the incredibly kind emails over the course of this semester, one, thank you. Two, little Miss Priss herself, Isis, little troublemaker that she is doing extremely well. She has 18 days left of treatment, and she's quite happy. She's jumping around. She doesn't look sick. Say hi, baby. Hi. Hi. Hey, gorgeous face. Hey, gorgeous girl. How are ya? Like, I'm fine, Dad. Screw you. Leave me alone. Is that what you said? How mean and rude. So here we are, back to where we were. So let's discuss a monetary policy shock. Right. So, monetary policy shock time. What's happening here? Well, we begin here in our equilibrium. So, for the new Keynesian model, this is if I ask you to derive the equilibrium, right, or start anywhere in the new Keynesian model, this is what you're going to want to draw. It is in the textbook, it is also in the previous lecture I put up, and it's right here. So, if you see the 5-graph system on an exam and I ask you to illustrate a certain type of shock, hint, it's probably going to be this guy right here. If I ask you to draw that, this is where you're going to want to start. Now, we start here, and under this monetary policy shock, right, the central bank goes, all right, well, what we want to do is we want to increase the money supply. So they increase the money supply from MT to MT1. The LM curve shifts out. We're going to want to leave quite a bit of room for this LM curve to shift out because there are really two movements in the LM curve. All right, so it's LM, we'll call it prime of MT prime and PT 0. All right, it's PT 0 because prices don't immediately respond to the shock. All right, so if there's a monetary policy shock, it's a surprise, right? It's a shock, right? Like in Casablanca, like shock to find gambling going on here, right? It's a surprise, so the price level doesn't immediately respond. So because the price level doesn't immediately respond, what the LM curve that is in pink is, call it LM prime of MT prime PT 0. All right, so far, nothing is really all that different. The interest rate falls. So it falls from RT0 down to RT prime. All right, and then if you remember, we did this with the real business cycle model. We draw this dotted line down. To be horizontal with the expected price level. And this is where the aggregate demand curve is going to shift out. Like this. Call it 80 prime. All right, so when the central bank prints more money, right, like in the United States, under the Federal Reserve, what they do is they will announce a lower target interest rate, and they will engage in open market operations until they achieve that target interest rate. So they will announce a lower interest rate, they will increase the money supply in order to achieve that lower interest rate. the real interest rate drops. Now, under the real business cycle model, the real interest rate would try to drop, but prices would immediately respond. They're perfectly flexible. They would just snap right back up, right? But here, prices aren't immediately flexible, so as it drops, right, it's still going to snap back up a little bit, but it's not going to snap back up to the extent that it does in the real business cycle model. So we see there's an increase in the money supply, interest rates drop. Now, if interest rates drop, that's going to stimulate an aggregate demand shock, right? So this reduction in the real interest rate will move the aggregate demand curve, just like what we saw in the real business cycle model. But instead of immediately snapping back to the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is what we saw in the RBC model, instead, we're going to be moving up to this short-run aggregate supply curve first. So what happens with that? Well, let me show you what happens with it. What we would like is output to be here at this price level, right? Just like RBC, but we don't get that. Instead, what we get is a price level that is here. Call it PT prime, right? So the price goes up a little bit. And output will increase a little bit to YT prime. Now you have to draw this dotted line from where aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply intersect. And this LM curve is going to shift back in just a little bit. Not much, not all the way, right, but a little bit. So like I was saying in the other video, it's kind of like a yo-yo, but like with really either like you throw the yo-yo down very badly, or we're on like Jupiter or something like that, and gravity is just insane, so you throw it, and then it comes back up, but it doesn't come all the way back up. So when it comes back up, but not all the way, means the interest rate, the real interest rate, is going to increase a little bit, but not all the way. So the real interest rate comes back up somewhere in between where RT0, the initial real interest rate, and this RT1, right, the interest rate following this monetary policy shock. But prices get to move a little bit, but they don't get to move all the way. All right, so real interest rate is going to increase. When the price level increases from the expected price level up to this intermediate price level called PT prime. So we are at in the short run aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply, not equal to long run aggregate supply. And then we just trace this dotted line down and over to our output curve, which had to kind of redraw the output curve to get it to actually map to a point on that output curve. like this. Okay, so I drew a lot of stuff. All right, well, because output increased, we trace to a new point in the output curve, which is right here, right? And because output increases as a result of an increase or a shock to aggregate demand, because output is increased because there's a demand shock, firms need more labor to produce more stuff. So because they need more labor, they will demand more labor. Labor demand shifts out. And this is going to be the short-run response to a monetary policy shock. So it looks like there's some more moving parts, and that's, well, because there are some more moving parts. Because we have sticky prices, which allow for responses and output to actually take place, because not all prices can adjust immediately in response to a monetary policy shock this time. So we actually get real responses in economic variables now. And if you remember back to the lecture that I gave on the empirical test of the real business cycle model, where we used real data and we looked at the dynamic impulse responses to monetary policy shocks, what we would see was something that actually kind of looked like this, right? The interest rate would drop, it would spike up a little bit, the price level would increase, but output would also increase a little bit, which would trigger a labor demand shock. So employment would go up, or conversely, unemployment would go down when output goes up. Wages would go up. And because prices would eventually begin to adjust, we would see everything kind of go back to where it started in the long run. But the medium run, the short to medium run, this is what we saw. All right, so let's summarize everything that happens here, right? In response to monetary policy shock, so the initial thing is money supply increases, right? Well, that means the real interest rate falls, the price level goes up, output goes up, hours worked go up, wages go up. Now, if you remember under the real business cycle model, the only variable of any of these that would change in response to a change in the money supply was the price level. This didn't move, this didn't move, this didn't move, this didn't move. But in the new Keynesian model, we see that in the short run, there actually are real economic variable responses, right? So this would therefore imply, in the short to medium run, monetary non-neutrality. Money is not neutral in the short run in this model. In the long run, however, money is neutral. But we're not at the long run yet, we're still at the short run. So what happens in the long run? How do we go from the short to medium run over to the long run? Well, remember, in the long run, everybody gets to update their prices. So when I showed you the setup and the discussion of the new Keynesian model, there was that omega term, right? And that was the share of firms that were able to update their prices. So if the omega represented the Calvo pricing mechanism, where firms are allowed to adjust their prices over time, when all firms get to adjust their prices, right, we converge back to an expected price level. It's just it's not going to be the same price level as what we had before. So that was the short and medium run stuff. Let's talk long run. So in the long run response to a monetary policy shock, what happens? Well, in the short run, we're here. So if you're like drawing the stuff out and you're like, hey, when do I need to stop doing this, right? When's Jeremy going to be happy for me to stop drawing graph changes? You stop here. Sounds like Vanna White, like, oh, Wheel of Fortune! Well, you stop drawing here for the short run, but when we want to know long run, what happens in the long run? Well, long run, all firms can update their prices. We'll say an LR for long run. So because all firms can set their prices, the price level is going to jump from this PT prime to PT2, right? But it's not just going to be PT2, it's actually going to be the expectation of PT2, the expected price level, right? Well, where is that? Where does this occur? It occurs where short run aggregate supply equals long run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. Well, how does that happen? Well, I can tell you right now where it's going to be. It's going to be right here. So getting a little crowded. You have PT2 right there. But there's no short run aggregate supply curve there. So what do? Well, when all firms get to change their prices, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts inward. So the short run aggregate supply curve, which is a function not of the price level, but it's a function of the expected price level. When the expected price level increases, short run aggregate supply is going to shift in. It's a negative short run aggregate supply shock. Now when that also happens, because the price level now increases, and it increases all the way back to where it was supposed to go under the real business cycle model, the LM curve shifts all the way back in, just like it did in the RBC model. Now when that happens, output's going to shift back in, meaning, boom, goes back to where it was. Run this blue dotted line in between the black dotted lines here. Like this, which means the labor demand shock that we did have goes negative again. The real wage drops, output drops back to where it was. And in the long run, I know it looks cluttered, it looks like there's a lot of stuff going on. But if you remove this short-run aggregate supply curve, that labor demand shock, and this LM2, this blue LM curve, if you remove that stuff, what you'll see is stuff that is identical to the real business cycle model. So in the long run, output, the real interest rate, because the real interest rate goes back up all the way. We call it RT3. Right, all of the real variables return to where they were prior to the monetary policy shock. So in the long run, we actually get the exact same responses that we got from the real business cycle model. But here there's a short run intermediate phase where there's an adjustment period in response to a monetary policy shock. Because prices are sticky, therefore, monetary policy shocks can actually transmit to the real economy. So, okay, prices are sticky. And because we also have monopolistic competition, because we need those two things in the new Keynesian model for this equilibrium to exist in the first place. So we've got monopolistic competition and we have sticky prices. So firms can mark their price above marginal cost and prices are slow to adjust. Again, wink, wink, two things that we need for this equilibrium to exist in the new Keynesian model. And because we have those two things, monetary policy shocks, a nominal shock, can transmit to the real economy. So the question is, how does this transmit to the real economy? And the way it transmits is through the real interest rate. As I've said in the lecture video that was like the PowerPoint presentation that was talking about the new Keynesian model setup, I said the real interest rate was the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. The transmission mechanism of monetary policy is a mechanism through which monetary policy can transmit from a nominal side of the economy to the real economy. Okay, tautologies are tautological. Great job, Jeremy. Thanks. What does that mean? It means it is a variable through which a monetary policy shock can actually trigger a real response. The new Keynesian model suggests the transmission mechanism is the real interest rate. It's a major point of contention in this model, and there are a lot of new Keynesian models, or types of models that fall into the class of new Keynesian models, we'll say, that actually argue there are different transmission mechanisms other than the real interest rate. Right? Some of my dissertation research actually looks at what the transmission mechanisms of monetary policy shocks are under the new Keynesian model. And I'll give you a hint. Probably not actually the real interest rate, because there are different types of transmission mechanisms or different types of channels through which monetary policy shocks can transmit to the real economy. This model predicts the real interest rate, but there are other types of channels as well. So in the next lecture or two, we'll be discussing the transmission mechanisms, right? Mechanisms through which it transmits a monetary policy shock to the real economy, and different ways to test for it, different ways to identify these interest rate channels, or these transmission channels, I mean. We can look at interest rate channels. We can also look at channels in which it operates through the stock market, right? If you ever pay attention to any Federal Reserve announcements, especially recently, they talk about really two different types of channels. They'll talk about a portfolio rebalancing channel, which generally operates through driving bond yields down, especially long-term bond yields downward, which then increases the, basically sends investors flocking from these long-term bond holdings over to the stock market, right? So you see stock prices increase as long-term bond yields fall. It's a portfolio rebalance channel. They also talk about signaling channels or short-term expected future interest rate channels, where the expected path of short-term rates is altered, which thereby induces investors to change their behavior. So there are all sorts of different transmission mechanisms through which monetary policy shocks can operate, and a lot of it is state dependent. Under certain conditions, monetary policy shocks will transmit through certain channels, and under different conditions, well, it'll operate through different channels. So we'll be talking about that. Stay tuned for that. That comes out in the next day or two. It will be out no later than Thursday. But in the meantime, practice this as much as you can. I'll be posting a practice problem thing for you to do, just drawing out different types of ways that this stuff can respond. I'll have some of them with the equilibrium set up. I'll have others where you have to draw the equilibrium out yourself to kind of give you a little bit of practice on this stuff. But if there's only going to be one shock in the new Keynesian model that I'm teaching, it means there's only going to be one shock I'm testing you over. This guy right here. Therefore, if you see any of the government spending, IS shocks, stuff like that, don't worry about it. If you see technology shocks in the new Keynesian model, don't worry about it. It's important stuff, yes. Do I think it's important for what we're doing in this course with the amount of time that we have left via this online learning stuff? No. This is the most important one. So stay tuned, and we will reconvene in the next day or so. And in the meantime, be on the lookout for a couple of practice worksheets and all that stuff to give you a little bit of extra help here. So thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time. Hey baby, will you be my little director? Will you be my little director? You're like, yeah, cut, Dad, cut. Isa says cut, so I have to cut now.